suppose you're going to say, he doesn't need any introduction. So that's the way I'll start out. Rabbi Michael Panitz does not need any introduction.
Thank you for coming.
Anyway,
Thank you for coming.
we've come to the final lecture in this series, Scripture on the silver screen. Silver screen, Uwe, you get that?
Yes, yes, indeed.
Tonight. So we will hear about the story of Esther, one night with a king. And I hope most of you got to see it. So before I give up my place here, Uwe and Rabbi Michael have been trying to set up another series to start in the fall.
Yay.
So we'll see what they come up with. We'll let you know what's going on, so you can plan to put aside a special day, whether it's Tuesday or Wednesday. We'll find out along the way. But anyway, see if there's any more notes here. I know we will look forward to that. And I know we're going to look forward to this evening. So listen carefully, and at the end of the lecture, have your questions ready. And at that point, Uwe is going to run around with the microphone. So, welcome, Rabbi Michael.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Reverend Uwe. And thank you to all of you for coming so steadfastly and regularly throughout our almost half year now.
Wow.
It's been a good series, and it seems to me that our numbers have remained strong and healthy throughout the entire series. So I haven't quite succeeded in chasing anyone away. Tonight, we're looking at one of the more recent films about the Hebrew Testament, and it's also one of the films that's about one of the chronologically later parts of the Hebrew Testament. One Night with the King, the story of the biblical Queen Esther. So, as I often do, I'll just start with a quick question, a quick show of hands for who has been able to see the film thus far. Almost everyone in the room. Okay, so I'll pitch my remarks, assuming that most of us know the film. If you haven't seen it, it's not too late to watch it. You can find it. It's I think most people have enjoyed it. It's a nice film. Let me give you a little chronology of the events of the Hebrew Bible to help put this film into a certain context. The Hebrew Bible deals with events before the beginning of the Christian era, obviously, Old Testament. But how old? So I'm not going to speak about the years of the likely composition of the books, which is a big, deep, scholarly subject, but of the events themselves. When are they likely to be dated? We'll go back to the period of Abraham and Sarah. I think that was the first film that we saw, Abraham. That may well be about 3,500 years ago, more or less, maybe a little bit more. In other words, about 1,500 years before the beginning of the Christian era, give or take. After the time of Abraham and Sarah and their family, we get to the next major chapter in the biblical history of the people of Israel, and that is the descent to Egypt and the emergence of not just a family, but of a nation, and of course, their enslavement in Egypt, which is probably about 1300 before the beginning of the Christian era. Moses, the Exodus, the sojourn in the Sinai Peninsula, probably the mid-1200s of the before the Common Era. entry into the land of Canaan under Joshua, beginning of the settlement of Israelite tribes in the land of Canaan, the low 1200s before the Common Era. Interestingly enough, there is extra-biblical archaeological confirmation of that. There is a famous plaque that was discovered by Sir Flinders Petrie in Egypt in the 1890s, which is called the Mer Nephthah stele, which you can see in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, where the Egyptian pharaoh Mer Nephthah boasts of having defeated the Israelites who are living in the land of Canaan. And this is the low, which means late, 1200s, before the beginning of the Christian era. So, although he's boasting about having defeated the Israelites and exterminated them, that was propaganda. He didn't exterminate them. I'm still here. But it does serve as an independent corroboration that there were Israelites there at that time. We call that time the period of the Judges. The organization of the Israelite society was by tribes. They weren't yet one unified nation. You may know a number of the judges of that era. You may have heard of Deborah, the female judge, or you may have heard of Gideon, long before he was in the business of dropping Bibles into hotel rooms. He was a judge in Israel. You may have heard of Samson, the strong man. So this is in the 1100s, 1000s, before the Common Era. The last of the judges, the prophet Samuel, who also anoints the first of the kings, Saul, and then the second of the kings, David. And that gets us to around 1000 before the Christian era. David, you know his son Solomon. David and Solomon represent a high point in the political fortunes of the people of Israel, and they are able to carve out not a very large state. I mean, Israel's like the size of New Jersey. It could fit several times over into Virginia, but it was larger then than it would be in later years. And in Solomon's time, which was a time of peace, the temple in Jerusalem, Solomon had it built and consecrated it. That's a high point in the biblical history. That's the mid-900s of before the Common Era. After that, there's a period where there's not one but two different rival kingdoms. There's Judah in the south of what had been the land of Canaan, where the descendants of David and Solomon continued to rule, and the northern kingdom, called the Kingdom of Israel, sometimes it's called Samaria, side by side with it. The Kingdom of Israel was destroyed by one of the empires of the region, the Assyrian Empire, in the low 700s. Judah survived another century and a quarter till the high 500s. It was destroyed by the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar. The Babylonians themselves were conquered by the Persians in the 530s before the Common Era. And the Persian era is where our story of Esther takes place. Now, what happened to the Persians? They were very successful. They had a large, large empire. It extended from Pakistan all the way to Ethiopia. It's a huge state. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Arabia, Israel, Egypt, Sudan, all one empire. Oh, and I forgot to mention Turkey, and a few of the Greek islands too. So very large, very successful state. What ended the Persian Empire? A military juggernaut under Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great's phalanxes had a new, revolutionary, different type of warfare that no one knew how to counter it until the time of the Romans. So that's why the Persian Empire fell, not because of any internal contradictions, but because it was overcome by a very powerful military enemy. So the story of Esther is set within the Persian period, from, let's say, the 530s to the 330s. Alexander the Great can be dated to the 330s. When in that period of time, we're not totally sure. We do have Persian records of a king Artaxerxes, sometimes Xerxes for short. Maybe his mother called him Xerxes. Artaxerxes. In the Bible, we have two kings who are variously named, maybe the same one. We have Artaxerxes and we have Ahasuerus. And it might well be the same, different spellings for Artaxerxes. Because there's no X in biblical Hebrew. Xerxes, X-E-R-X-E-S. So what you have is an approximation of some Persian sound, anyway. When did this king live, Xerxes? In the 400s, before the Common Era. We know about this king from Greek sources because he attempted an invasion of Greece and was defeated. A big naval engagement, the Battle of Salamis. And we know about this from the Greek histories. So it could be that we're talking about that Persian emperor. We're not 100% sure. One problem, the Persian emperors, their wives, some of their names are listed. Xerxes never had a wife named Esther who's listed in the Persian records or the Greek records. There was a queen, Amestris, A-M-E-S-T-R-I-S. So it's possible that the name of a known Persian queen was taken by the author of our book of Esther as a good Persian style name. I hope that our Queen Esther was not to be identified with the Amestris of Persian records, because she was notably cruel, very cruel queen. So hopefully they just borrowed the name. A little bit like the name Henry for an English king. Do you remember that song from the 1960s? I'm Eneridiath I am, Eneridiath I am. Remember that? So Henry's a good name for an English king, right? Well, nowadays we'd say Charles, but Henry's a good name for an English king. So Esther's a good name for a Persian queen. Maybe that's what's going on. The book of Esther tells us a great deal about the inner workings of the Persian court. And it also tells us about a strategy for survival for the Jewish people. So let me give you a mini lecture about the biblical book of Esther, and then we'll transition to the film. Most of the history books of the Hebrew Bible either take place in the period before the Israelites enter Canaan, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, etc., or when they first entered the land of Canaan, Joshua, Judges, or when they had their independent state under their kings, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles. Very few books of the Hebrew Bible deal with the later period of time. Book of Daniel does, book of Ezra, Nehemiah, and of course the book of Esther. The book of Esther actually gives a certain strategy for the Jewish people how to cope with not being independent. Because if you think about it, the book of Samuel, the book of Kings, the struggle is to be independent. In the book of Esther, that's not a possibility. The very first verse of the book of Esther tells us that this took place in the days of King Ahasuerus, the same king who ruled from India to Ethiopia. There's no rebelling against such a king. The vast power at his disposal means that success for the Jewish people living in Persia is to make a go of it without resuming the independence that was the norm under King David. They have to strive for other things. What do they have to strive for? Well, if not independence, then at least respect and protection. The government has to be willing to protect them from enemies who would destroy them, and to respect their right to live following the dictates of their religion. That's really what the book of Esther is about. There's a plot to destroy the Jews within the Persian Empire. It's not an external attack upon the Persians. It's a prime minister within Persia who maneuvers the king into allowing a genocidal plot. And that is, of course, the wicked Haman. In the Jewish synagogue, whenever we have the festival of Purim and we mention the name Haman, people make noise with noisemakers in order to blot out the name of the wicked one, just like that. It's very striking for someone who goes for the first time ever to a synagogue. If your first visit ever is on the Feast of Esther, you'll think that they're all crazy. In the middle of nowhere. Think of it as Jewish Mardi Gras, and you'll understand. So, what is the counsel given in the book of Esther? Well, you got to understand the political rules of the game of the country that you're living in. You have to know how to function in that environment. You have to be willing to defend yourself if push comes to shove. And don't lose your faith in God. That's really the formula there. And I want to emphasize that the book of Esther does not have prophets walking around. There's no one like the prophet Samuel or the prophet Nathan or the prophet Isaiah who can get up and say, "Thus says the Lord." They don't know that in the book of Esther. It's not a generation that has prophets. And the proof of it is in chapter 4, when Mordecai, the Jewish courtier, who's learned about the genocidal plot against the Jews by Haman, urges Queen Esther to appear unsummoned before the king. Now, court protocol, the movie was very big on court protocol and don't violate court protocol. That actually follows what we do know about Persian imperial practice. The protocol was very strict. By the way, the Greeks hated it. When Greek ambassadors had to go and make representations before the Persian king of kings, as they called themselves, they hated having to make the ritual gestures of obeisance. It irked them so much, but they had to do it, when in Rome, right? When in Susa, do as the Susans do. Right? So Mordecai says to Esther, "Who knows? Is this why you won the contest and were named queen? Who knows?" He's thinking maybe this is God's finger of providence, but he doesn't know. And so the book of Esther, in some ways, is not like the other books of the Bible. It's more like the world we live in, where we pray, we have faith, we hope, but we don't know with a certainty because there's no prophets walking around our midst. See that? The book of Esther in some ways is radically more modern than some of the other books of the Bible, precisely in that uncertainty. And as I think any of us who lived and thought about the world we're living in, having faith in an era of uncertainty is a different kind of accomplishment than having faith in an era of faith. And so those of us who continue to have faith when the world doesn't automatically give a confirmation for it, that's to be respected. And that's the story in the book of Esther. And the Jewish people are successful in the book of Esther, not without having to defend themselves. It can really get down to that. But by the end, you have the king recognizing the right of the Jewish people to exist within the empire as a people with their own traditions. And Mordecai is the prime minister at the very end of the book. Also at the very end of the movie. The very, very last part of the movie, you have Mordecai suddenly dressed, magnificently. He's the one giving the orders, and all the scribes are taking down his words. And he ends up by saying, "Mordecai, the Jew." Remember that? That's how the movie ends. Although the real Mordecai didn't speak with the Welsh accent of the actor John Rhys. I'm sure of that. I'm sure he didn't speak a Welsh accent, a Persian accent, in Hebrew. So that's the book itself. Let's now understand the film. Let me walk through the plot of the film as it agrees with the Hebrew Bible, and then let me stand on the parts that are different. It starts with something different, and I'll circle back to that. It starts with a flashback to the days of King Saul, and I'll come back to that. Then when the story of Esther starts, in the Bible, the very first thing you have is King Ahasuerus is giving a party in the 3rd year of his reign, and Queen Vashti has her own party for the women. And when the king summons her, as it says, when his heart was merry with wine, she wouldn't come. And that incensed him, and he asked his counselors who knew protocol what should be done, and the answer was she should be banished from the king's sight and let the king choose a more suitable queen. That's chapter 1 of the book of Esther. How does that compare with the movie? So, first of all, the movie begins with the war of the army of King Saul of Israel against the people Amalek. So in other words, the movie starts 6 centuries before the book of Esther. But why does it do that? There's a good reason for it. When the bad guy, Haman, is introduced, he's called Haman the Agagite. Who's Agag? Well, Agag is the king of Amalek in the first book of Samuel, chapter 15. And we learn that the king of Amalek, although he was supposed to have been executed by King Saul, the prophet Samuel comes upon the scene, and Saul is negotiating with Amalek, negotiating with Agag. He hasn't executed him. Samuel executes him. But according to the rabbis, in that interval of time, Agag's wife managed to become pregnant and survived. And that's why Haman is called the Agagite. Haman is the descendant of this Amalekite king. So the movie makes a great deal of that. The movie gives you a motivation. Why is Haman so hateful towards the Jews? Well, the answer is he's got a score to settle. He's the Amalekite. He's trying to reverse the verdict of that earlier war, which his ancestor lost to King Saul. And then the movie has something else too, which is very striking. It's a visual symbol. Do you remember the insignia that Haman adopts as his own? Doesn't it look uncomfortably like a swastika? Remember that? Yeah. So what point is that making about Haman? That he's a Hitler wannabe. Really? That his motivation is hatred, genocidal hatred. So that goes a long way towards explaining the movie's characterization of Haman. But as for the king's party and the queen's party, the Bible doesn't tell you why the queen doesn't go in front of the king's party to honor his request, but the movie has a whole backstory, a whole sidebar story. Do you remember why Queen Vashti doesn't want Ahasuerus to go to war against Greece? By the way, there's nothing in the Hebrew Bible about Greece going to war with Persia, but we know from the Greek historians that the Persians were fighting against the Greeks. So the movie has borrowed from what we know from Herodotus, the great Greek historian. So Vashti doesn't want her husband to go fight against the Greeks. And why is that? The husband says, you know, the Greeks killed my father. I have to avenge him. And what does the queen say to him? She says, that's not your métier. You are more skillful in the peacetime administration of Persia going to war against Greeks is not your best suit. That's not how you're going to do the best for Persia. You might not even survive.
Mhm.
He doesn't want to hear that. He's very military in his bearing. He's very manly. I think he never really learned to put a shirt on and keep it on for very long. Right? He likes to be in the buff and fighting with his generals. 3-on-1, 4-on-1. Remember that scene?
Uh-huh.
He thinks he'd make just a dandy warrior. So Vashti says, they're playing you. All these treacherous courtiers who want you to do that. It's not in your interest. It's in their interest. It's not in your interest. And he doesn't listen to her. So why doesn't she go to his party in the movie? Because she says that will play into the hands of those who want him to march off to war. She thinks that's unwise policy. The Bible doesn't tell us why she said no, although the Bible gives us a hint. The Bible says, on the 7th day of the after party, sometimes these people get the most drunk during the after party. The king has a party that lasts for 180 days. And then he has an after party that lasts for 7 days, when those who are closest to royalty really get to whoop it up. So it says, on the 7th day, when the king's heart was merry with wine, he gave orders for Vashti to come wearing her royal crown. What else was she wearing? Bible doesn't say. It seems as if Vashti felt that she was being demeaned, treated like some sort of slave dancing girl. And she was too noble for that. She's not going to be paraded around in front of a bunch of drunken sots. So it seems that that's why she says no, and the king, of course, male chauvinist that he is, interprets that as an affront to his patriarchal authority. But the whole of chapter 1 of the book of Esther, in a way, is designed to start the story. Because until there's a vacancy, there's no chance for this Jewish girl Hadassah to become queen. The job is taken until Vashti gets banished. So, chapter 2 of the book of Esther, the king has settled down, and he's feeling a little bit lonely for female companionship, perhaps. And his courtiers say, why don't we assemble all the most desirable-looking virgins around, and they'll be in the harem, and the king will sample the wares. And then the king will decide who should be the next queen. It says the king liked that idea a lot. The king really liked that idea. So it says all of the virgins were taken. It's like they're kidnapped into the fortress of Shushan, and Hadassah amongst them. Now the movie gets that pretty right. Remember the scene where they're just kidnapping young women? They're also kidnapping young men. That's not in the Bible, but we'll get to that. They're kidnapping young women to go to the harem. Now, Mordecai, who is variously described as the uncle and as the cousin to Hadassah, advises her not to reveal her name or her ethnicity. Hadassah, by the way, is a good Jewish name. It means myrtle, the myrtle tree. Like Virginia has the crepe myrtle, Hadassah means myrtle. Now, in English, myrtle is a woman's name. Not a very popular one today, but it has been in the past, right? So Hadassah. So Mordecai tells her, don't reveal your ethnicity. And the suspicion is because it might not go well for you. So already there's some sense of danger. Now, you may know that one of the basic rules of drama is that if something is a secret in Act 1, it'll be revealed by the end of Act 3. Right? Or as the playwright Anton Chekhov said, if there's a pistol on the table in Act 1, it's going to be fired by Act 3. So, if Hadassah conceals her Jewish identity in chapter 2, you, the astute reader of the Hebrew Bible, which in many ways is much more like drama than it's like novel, you know that her revealing her name and her ethnicity will become important later. That's the rules of the genre that the Bible stories are written in. Conceal, reveal. That's the way this works. So she doesn't take what back then was a Jewish name, she takes a Babylonian name. For us, it's hard to realize that, because for us, Esther feels like a Jewish name. But in the days of the original Esther, it wasn't a Jewish name. It's like the name Christina. If you just met someone named Christina, would you think that's a Jewish name? No, because of Christ, right? If you met a gentleman named Xavier, would you think that that's a Jewish name? Probably not, right? So what is Esther in its original form? The Babylonian goddess Ishtar. Esther, Ishtar, that's who it was. One of the main goddesses of the Babylonian religion. In fact, one of the main gates leading into Babylon was called the Ishtar Gate. I think it's in the Berlin Museum. I'm not sure, I think it's there. The Berlin Museum. You know, the Europeans in the 19th century plundered a lot of the archaeological, relics from the ancient Near East, and from Greece also, the Elgin marbles, for example. So some of the greatest archaeological finds are no longer in Iraq or Israel or Egypt, but they're now in places like London and France and Berlin. And even a few of them in Boston. And even a few in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Now the Temple of Dendur, big Egyptian temple, been completely reconstructed in the Metropolitan Museum. It's one of the biggest exhibits at the Metropolitan. So we see Esther being kidnapped and taken to the harem. We also see her boyfriend getting kidnapped. And it turns out that he gets castrated and turned into a eunuch. You don't see that. Although, by the way, the movie is not based straight on the Bible. It's based on a novel. And the novel is called One Night with the King. And the novel goes through the grisly details of that. So if you feel cheated that the movie didn't show you all that, read the novel One Night with the King, and you can read that to your heart's delight. No thanks. No thank you, Rabbi. So when she gets to the harem, it turns out there's a very sympathetic character. I should confess my personal response. I like this character the most of all of the characters in the movie. Do you know who I'm referring to? Yeah. Haggai, the chief eunuch, right? This big, strong fellow, right? Who at one point was probably even bigger and stronger until he had an unfortunate accident. But there's something very winning about him. And he ends up really favoring Esther. And at one point, she doesn't want to let go of his arm, remember? Yeah. And he's taking her to the king's apartment, and he's the one she trusts. And he says, Esther. I can't even get my voice as deep as his. It wasn't James Earl Jones, but that role could have been acted by James Earl. Remember the guy from Field of Dreams? Baseball. It's that kind of a voice. Or maybe it's like Darth Vader, right? I am your father. That's a little bit what the voice is like. He's really a very lovely character. Now, movies have to have some bit of originality. We might not like it that they don't say exactly what the Bible said, but the Bible tells us that Esther charmed everybody, and that she especially charmed Haggai, the chief eunuch. So what did she do to charm him? Realize he sees all the candidates for Miss Persia all the time. So the movie maker's idea is, well, it's not just physical beauty, although she has plenty of that, right? They chose a beautiful actress, a physically beautiful actress. By the way, I want you to know something about the actress. I did some research into her. Her name is Tiffany DuPont. She hasn't appeared very much since this movie. She appeared in a few episodes of the crime show NCIS. You ever watch NCIS with Gibbs and all that? She's a recurring guest star there. Sometimes the other crime show CSI, but she hasn't done a lot of work. She's that rare Hollywood actress who prefers to have children and raise a family. And she let it be known that she's a committed Christian, and she will only take wholesome roles, which probably denied her a lot of opportunities in Hollywood, because she wants to confine herself to wholesome roles. Well, this was a wholesome role. She has plenty of romance, but nothing unseemly that the movie camera is capturing, right? It's more romantic and not erotic in this case. That's fine. So, what is it that charms Haggai so much? The Bible doesn't say what the movie says, but I like the movie's idea. Esther is literate. Now stop and think about why that would charm him. As far as physical beauty is concerned, he's seen it all. But a woman who's literate, who can read in several languages, who can read Gilgamesh in the original. Remember, that's what moves him so much. She's reading the Epic of Gilgamesh in the original. That's very impressive. He's impressed by her brains, not just by her beauty. I like that. I must say that as a viewer of the movie, I thought that was a very nice touch. So he has her go and read to the king before her night, before her big audition. Remember that? Not in the Bible. Does it move the story forward? Yes, it does. Because she has to read to the king the most boring, stuff out, so many shipments of grain and this and that. And then she decides to change the script. Remember what she changes it to? It becomes very significant. The love story of Jacob and Rachel. So she just starts telling it. It's a story from the Hebrew Bible, from Genesis. King's never heard it before. And you can see on the other side of the curtain how he's beginning to get interested. By the way, this touch of royal insomnia, is that in the Bible? Yes. Yes, chapter 6 of the book of Esther. One night the king's sleep fled from him. So the Bible tells us that at least once the king suffered from insomnia, and the movie says it seems to be a regular recurring problem. And the best thing that he's figured out is to have people read boring economic annals to him. And Esther, who's a little bit mischievous, just a little bit mischievous in this story, unilaterally changes it to the story of Jacob and his beloved Rachel. And the king is certainly intrigued. And he tells Esther, you will read for me again at some point. Now, when the time comes, Esther doesn't want to have all that finery that some of the other women want to have, the bling-bling and the bracelets and the jewels and so on and so forth. But she does have one very important necklace, which is also not in the Bible. But it's very important for the purpose of this retelling. Do you remember what's special about her necklace? It has a stone with a Jewish star, the Star of David. The two triangles, interlocked triangles. Today, that's, of course, the insignia of the flag of Israel. So, total anachronism. Complete anachronism. The Star of David does not appear in Jewish art until the Middle Ages. There is a banner at the Alt Neue Schule, the Old New Synagogue in Prague, which is a Jewish, because there was an old synagogue, and there was an old new synagogue, and then there was a new synagogue. So this is the Alt Neue Schule, the old new synagogue in Prague. Has a banner with a Star of David on it, maybe going back to the 1500s or 1600s. That's about as far back as we can trace the Star of David as a Jewish iconographic symbol. So it's certainly not a Jewish symbol from the time of the book of Esther. let alone from the movie David and Bathsheba with Gregory Peck. King David didn't walk around with the Star of David on his tunic either. This is Hollywood. But this film has something very, very important about it. When you hold the necklace to the flame, to an oil lamp, what happens? The stars begin to show, right? And when does that theme recur? Remember how she loses her necklace, and the king suspects her of having being unfaithful to him, and that's Hollywood, right? Because if you don't lose his favor, you can't regain his favor. Right? So it tries to make it very dramatic like that. But finally, when the plot against the Jews is about to go into effect, because the king is about to leave to go invade Greece, the queen has to catch him before that. So it's raining, and she can't wait for the carriage, so she runs through the rain. She's totally bedraggled. Remember that? Yeah. She bursts into the chamber. She comes unbidden, and the keepers of protocol draw their swords. They're ready to cut her down. And at the last minute, Ahasuerus intervenes. He saves her. She collapses in his arms. And he grants her a request. What is her request? Come to my pavilion for a little party, you and Haman. So what's her game? At that point, she is resolved to do what her uncle Mordecai has counseled her to do, reveal that she is Jewish, and beg the king to spare her. Turns out the king doesn't even know that there's a hate out on all the Jews. Is that biblical that the king should not know? Yes, it is. Because in chapter 3, Haman says to the king, there is one particular people scattered throughout your majesty's domain. They don't follow your majesty's laws, and it doesn't behoove you to tolerate them. And what's more, if you allow me to wipe them out, I'll confiscate 10,000 talents of gold and silver and deposit them in the royal treasury. That was enough for the king. He never knew whose death warrant he was signing. So Esther says, you have signed my death warrant. That's a big surprise to the king. So remember the scene? The king and Haman and Esther are in this little pavilion. She's just finished serving them a lovely dinner. And he says, okay, Esther, you told me you would tell me your request. I have to march at dawn, so it's, tell me now. And her request is, my request is that you spare my life. Spare your life? Who's trying to take your life? That wicked, wicked man, Haman. Some of you might remember the Purim song. Oh, once there was a wicked, wicked man, and Haman was his name, sir. He would have murdered all the Jews, though they were not to blame, sir. Oh, today will Mary, Mary be. Remember the song? Today will Mary, Mary be. Oh, today will Mary, Mary be, and Nosh some hum and tash. And it's a British song, actually, it happens. So, according to the 7th chapter of the book of Esther, the king is so nonplussed that he goes into the garden to gather his wits. And Haman, in the Bible, is terrified, and he falls upon the chaise lounge, the couch where Esther is reclining. Remember, they didn't sit up the way the movie shows. They're like, Elizabeth Taylor, Cleopatra, peel me a grape. That's the way they did it back then. They reclined. So he's like falling all over the queen, begging for his life, and he's not keeping his distance. I kept my promise, you keep your distance. You know that song from Evita? Don't Cry for Me, Argentina? Right? He's not keeping his promise, he's not keeping his distance. And the king walks in and he says, would you actually rape the queen in my own house? And that's when Haman gets dragged away and killed. In the Bible. In the movie, it's different. In the movie, Haman says, you thought I would grovel after that performance? That doesn't convince anybody. And Haman begins to gloat and gloat and gloat, and then he practically is choking her when the king walks in.
Mm-hmm.
So the king executes Haman to save Esther's life. So it's a different valence, but Esther says to the king, "Why did you come back?" And this is the best line in the whole movie. Again, it's not in the Bible, but what does he say in answer to "Why did you come back"? "I saw the stars."
Mm.
So I want you to notice how intricately well the film is put together. At the beginning, when Esther's a little girl in her parents' house, well, that's a flashback, because she's an orphan girl when we first meet her. But in the flashback, she remembers how her father, Abihail, and her mother gave her this little necklace, and it's very precious to her, because if you hold it to the light, you see Jewish stars. So she gives it to the king, because she's really fallen in love with him. He makes her shiver, as they say, right? Makes her shiver. Actually, that's a Southern expression. Makes her shiver.
Hmm.
And I tell you where I got that from. Anyone know the great Southern author Carson McCullers? You ever read anything by Carson McCullers, the member of the wedding, her most famous novel? She has the 12-year-old protagonist, Frankie, talking with the cook and the maid in the house, whose name is Bernice. And Frankie asks Bernice, a young woman asking an older woman, why didn't you marry so-and-so? And she says, well, I respect him and I admire him. Well, he don't make me shiver. It's a great line. So Ahasuerus makes her shiver. Anyway, so you see that he has recalled the love that was challenged. He enfolds her in his arms, happily ever after. Haman's gone. He's hanged on the gallows that he created for Mordecai, and Mordecai becomes the prime minister, as we've seen. So what we have here is a movie based on a novel of the same title by a Christian novelist who specializes in retelling Bible stories based on a Bible story. So it's 2 steps away from the original story, but I dare say it keeps a lot of the original sense of how can the Jewish people survive when there are enemies who are bent on genocide against them. It does keep that. It adds the rabbinic overlay of Haman comes from this inveterate enemy of the Jewish people, the people Amalek, and that's what his ethnic name Agag means. So it gives you that. And I should tell you, the movie was from 2006. I watch it these days, I rewatch it in the aftermath of this Hamas attack on Israel in 2023, which is still unresolved business. And I watch it as I think about what's Persia doing today. And the answer is that the Islamic Republic of, it's not really a republic, it's really a dictatorship. The Islamic State of Iran is actively pursuing nuclear weapons, which it openly says it plans to use against Israel. So I should tell you, of the various stories of the Bible, they're always relevant. The book of Esther is chillingly relevant to me. And I think that this story has an effective way of retelling it. So I'm glad that we concluded with it. I think it's a strong final film. It has its moments, of course. Those of us who like a story to stay closer to the Bible have what to criticize. There's nothing in the original that Esther really wants to go to Jerusalem. She's ready to go to Jerusalem. It's sweet, but it's not the Bible. But by now you know me. I pardon those departures because what I want to see is at the end, have they told a good story that at least has a passing resemblance to the Bible story that it's based on. Anyway, thank you. I'm deliberately finishing a few minutes early because I really want to encourage some more questioning and answering. So anyway, thank you very much for your attention both tonight and also throughout our series. Thank you. And now Chattanooga has the standing
seat. So if you would raise your hand if you have a question or a comment, and then also would you say your name so that Rabbi Michael can address you personally. Who has the first question or comment or observation?
Please. Oh, here we go.
Over there.
Tom.
Here we go.
Yeah, this is Tom. Xerxes,
Your name?
king,
Tom.
He
Tom.
said Tom.
Xerxes, the king of Persia, this enormous empire, probably lived in some big city.
Susa, yes.
Somewhere. And there's a sizable Jewish population in Persia, in this city of the king.
Yes.
Okay, I'm just kind of confused.
So
Why
let's
would
understand
Jewish
that.
people in the Persian Empire?
So let's understand that. When they went into exile in Babylon, which is maybe a century before the events of this story, the Judeans, whom later on we can call the Jews, it's the same word in Hebrew, Yehudi, the Judeans were separated from their land. They were exiled, and they became an urban people. So urban people generally make a living by commerce, one way or the other, or by the professions. So as cities arise, a city by definition is a commercial hub. It's the engine of urban life. It is commerce. So it's not surprising that once the Jewish people had been uprooted from its land and transformed into a commercial rather than agricultural people, that if the Persian Empire would arise, its capital city would attract a Jewish population, just as Babylon had a Jewish population. Now let's remember that the one Jewish resident of Susa, whom we get to know well, Mordecai, is a scribe. That's his job. We don't know that from the Bible. That's again the thinking of this film. Which means he's literate and he's in the service of the government. So, do we know if Jews were in the service of the Persian government? Actually, we do. There's a remarkable set of papyri that were found in an island community all the way in the south of Egypt by something called the First Cataract of Egypt, near today's site of the Aswan High Dam. And in Greek, this little island was called Elephantine because there was a trade in ivory from south of the Sahara Desert into the Persian Empire, later on into the Roman Empire. And Jewish soldiers were hired as border guards by the Persians. We know this because we have the documents of that community. Believe it or not, of all the museums in the world, this is in the Brooklyn Museum. So if you go online, look up Brooklyn Museum Aramaic Papyri. BMAP, Brooklyn Museum Aramaic Papyri, and you'll see this set of 30 or 40 or 50 documents that tell us so much about the life of that Jewish community working for the Persian administration. So if Mordecai works for a Persian emperor, that's not so surprising, actually. Is that interesting? Who knew? It's probably the last Jewish military force hired by a non-Jewish government ever. Well, actually, no, I'll tell you when the next one was. 1861. Abraham Lincoln calls for volunteers, and one synagogue in Illinois, in Chicago, had so many volunteers that they created an entire company of the 82nd Illinois Volunteer Regiment. They fought at the Battle of Gettysburg. There's a monument in their honor on the north side of the city, because that was their first battle line. And their captain, a Jewish fellow named Edward Salomon, later on rose to brigadier general on the general staff of General Grant, He finished the war at Appomattox, he was there, and President Grant appointed him to be the Governor General of Washington Territory. So that's pretty high, right?
Yeah.
But that's 1861. And the last time before that there was a Jewish outfit in the army with a Jewish officer that fought for, not for Israel, but for some non-Jewish state, Civil War. And before that, Persian Empire. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the question. Sir?
Whenever the emperor gave an edict, it could not be reversed. So in order to save the Jews, he allowed them to attack those.
To defend themselves, right?
Well, the question is, the Bible always is in the future. Everything else you can put on bird cages, but it's still there to be around. What is Iran going to be doing when Israel decides it wants to retaliate?
Well, I think the Iranians will, a little bit too late, realize that they've been going in the wrong direction. But they can do a lot of damage before then. So I'm hoping they can be stopped before they land the first blow. Yeah. Interestingly enough, Iran had friendly relations with Israel until 1979. Israel pursued friendly relations with the Shah of Iran. And when the Shah was overthrown, that the current administration of Iran became the most virulent of the anti-Israel forces. You know, some states in the region made peace with Israel. Egypt made peace with Israel. Jordan made peace with Israel. Morocco made peace with Israel. United Arab Emirates made peace with Israel, but not Iran. You know, they want to eliminate the Zionists completely, still to this day. And that's true. Thank you for the observation. Thank you. Someone else? Yes,
All right,
here
over
up
there,
front.
one moment. And please state your name. So the previous questioner was Reverend Bierman.
I've heard of the Doomsday Book,
First your name.
Alice Sporey.
Alice.
The Doomsday Book, it was published in about the 1300s. Now, did the Jewish people have something similar to that, where their names would be kept?
It's interesting you say that. There are several different biblical references to book. The first comes when Moses is pleading with God not to destroy the Israelite tribes after the sin of the golden calf. God says to Moses, leave me alone and I'll just destroy them and I'll create the people from your descendants. And Moses, in one of his most selfless and highest moments, says, I don't want that. If you're not going to spare them, erase me from your book. That's chapter 33, I think, 34 maybe, 33 of Exodus. Erase me from your book. That's the first reference to this. The next reference that comes to my mind is the book of Daniel, chapter 12, where you have the angel revealing the secrets of the cosmos to Daniel. And that's the first very clear reference in the Hebrew scriptures to what we call the resurrection of the dead. That many of those who sleep in the dust will come back to life. That's chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. And there too you have those recorded in the book. So that's where, those are the biblical roots of this notion of a book that a ledger that God keeps. Now, from that, you have the Jewish high holiday prayer saying that God has a book of life, and we earnestly pray that God will inscribe us in the book of life. That's the characteristic wish and prayer for the Jewish New Year. Lishana Tova Tikateu. May you be inscribed, meaning in the book, for a good year, a year of blessing. So that's a very powerful image in the Jewish religion. So thank you for the question. I think in the back.
All right, in the back, yes, I'll come there. Hold on, Al. It is Al Kunkel, so he doesn't need to say his name then if he doesn't want to. Okay, he wanted to. Who are you, sir?
I seem to remember some translations of this 70-foot pole that Haman built, that they call it a gallows as opposed to just a pole. And impaling on a 70-foot pole seems rather interesting, where hanging on a gallows would seem more logical.
Well, the Hebrew word is eitz, which means a tree, and the verb is litlot, which means to suspend someone. So hanging seems more like what they did. Now, impaling, they did do that in the Middle East. You've heard of Vlad the Impaler? That was the original Count Dracula. Vlad the Impaler. What a way to go.
But how do you do it up on a high, how do you impale somebody? How do you get them up there?
You mean what's a biblical cherry picker?
Could you repeat the question?
How could you even impale someone so high up? Well, obviously, it'd have to be where you could reach him first, but I think he was hanged, actually. Personally, I think that the verb is most easily translated as hanged.
Because before I came down here, I read Esther again, and I'm thinking, I don't understand how this can happen.
Well, the Hebrew verb is not clearly rendered one way or the other. It means to suspend. People can be suspended in different ways. Sir?
I think that the example of Jesus Christ being suspended between heaven and earth would be very similar, that they want people to see him. And so how it happened, we're not really concerned about. The fact is, they wanted people to see him.
Well, yes, there's a public deterrent value to this. I'll come right back to that, but chapter 7 of the book of Esther, verse 9, then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Look, the very gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose words saved the king, stands at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. Now, do you remember the Kirk Douglas film Spartacus? Who's his sidekick? Tony Bennett? No. Tony Curtis, who spoke to Spartacus with a Brooklyn accent. Spartacus! I remember a lot. Spartacus, I love that moment. But at the end of that, it's a terrible scene, and it's based on the Roman history. The Romans crucified these rebels along the Appian Way, the main highway leading into Rome, one crucified after another. And of course, they did that to be a public deterrent. Look what happens if you rebel against Rome. Of course. By the way, in the Middle Ages, the English kings did the same thing. They decapitated the political rebels, and they put their heads on spikes on the London Bridge. The Brooklyn Bridge is another kind of bridge. On the London Bridge. So I've been on London Bridge, but I didn't see any heads on it. By the way, people thought that when the French invented the guillotine, it was much more humane because it dispatched the victim so quickly, right? Maybe so. The recent movie version of Napoleon, which came out about a year ago, begins with the guillotine execution of Marie Antoinette. That's the very beginning of it. Anyway, I think the best use of guillotines is for cigars.
We have time for one more question, if anybody has a question.
Last question of the season.
All
Sir,
right, over there.
Here we go.
Over. Name.
My name is Roger. lot of trouble with how Mordecai discovered this. Those two guys, he overheard some on the street.
Yes,
Is that really a
Yes, Bigtan and Teresh. I should not have removed the bookmark. Let me go to the table of contents. It's at the end of chapter 2 of the book of Esther. Mordecai is sitting in the gate of the palace, and he overhears it. The two assassins were, they thought that no one was overhearing them. But I'm going to give you the exact quote in just a moment. Esther, page 612. You know, Chaplain, that when I use this book, it's an away game that I'm pitching. Here we go. Chapter 2. In those days, verse 21, in those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigtan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Ahasuerus, which the movie does show. But the matter came to the knowledge of Mordecai. Doesn't say how in the Bible. We presume that he overheard it. And he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, both the men were hanged on the gallows. It was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. And that detail becomes important because it shows up again in chapter 6, where the king has Mordecai be honored, and it shows up again in chapter 8, where Harvona remembers this scene as well. So the book of Esther, short though it be, is very carefully constructed, and in a literary sense, packs a big punch. I also want to tell you something that I've always found intriguing in the last verse of the book of Esther. Now, Mordecai has just saved the entire Jewish people from extermination. You'd think that if ever a Jewish leader could get 100% approval rate, it would have been Mordecai. But it says in the last verse of Esther, Mordecai, this great leader, had the favor of most of the Jews. You can't get, all those of you who've served in a congregation, you can't get 100% approval. Don't look for it. Don't lose sleep over that. Anyone who's been a congregational pastor knows what I'm talking about. Mordecai didn't get 100%. I'm not going to get it. You're not going to get it either. Don't fret. Anyway, friends, this is always a delight. I really appreciate the opportunities we've had to be together this year, and I dearly hope that we can continue.
That concludes this evening's lecture and discussion. Once more, in terms of preview, we are thinking about having another lecture series. I do need to write a proposal to the Lifespire Foundation, and most likely it will be something like the Jewish experience throughout the centuries, where we again would pick 5 movies, among them a comedy, most likely.
Well, can I just see a quick show of hands if you've seen any of the following films?
Okay.
Have you seen Ivanhoe? Sir Walter Scott, Robert Taylor, Elizabeth Taylor? Yeah. How about The Frisco Kid? You seen that?
Frisco Kid?
Yeah, with Harrison Ford. Right. Have you seen Hester Street, Carol Kane's film about the immigrants at the turn of the century? Beautiful, beautiful film. Have you seen the musical Fiddler on the Roof? I didn't mention this to you, but just as a question, very early Hollywood, 1931, an expose of anti-Semitism in Tsarist Russia called The Yellow Ticket. Did anyone ever see it? That's a hidden gem. How about, there are many movies about the Holocaust, and they're all so sad, but one which is maybe a slightly different nuance than the others. Have you seen a film called Defiance, about the partisans who fled into the forest and survived there? It's a very interesting story. stars Daniel Craig and Lev Schieber. So, how about Otto Preminger, Exodus, 1961? Okay. So some people have seen. I'm gathering that they might want to see them again, especially if I gave a lecture about each one.
Wonderful. All right, so if we get that through, which I'm very hopeful, that will be our third lecture series. And Lifespire.
Excuse me. There's one more film I meant to tell you.
All right.
I forgot. This is a beautiful story about the friendship of two teenage boys. One of them is the son of a Hasidic rabbi. The other one is the son of a more modern-oriented person. It's called The Chosen. Set in Brooklyn in the 1940s. Beautiful, beautiful story. So, has anyone seen that? Oh, it's a beautiful story. Okay.
So the time frame would be roughly similar to this. We would most likely have one lecture in November of this year, then intentionally no lecture in December because it's a very busy holiday time. And then the remaining lectures would be then January through May, so instead of going into June. But we'll submit a proposal roughly the middle of July and hopefully know something by the middle of August. So still plenty of time for you to plan. If indeed the first lecture will be in November. Let's give a final round of applause to the Rabbi.
I was afraid you were going to forget this. I was bringing it to you.
Thank you, thank you.
Very good, very good.
All right, thank you.